A big part of my career has been looking at the therapeutic value of the 12 steps, because the 12 steps really have harnessed some powerful psychological forces that creates an amazing change in our life. What is that change? Well, the truth is that the 12 steps are engineered to help us achieve emotional sobriety, to achieve true independence of spirit, to achieve autonomy, to learn how to take care of ourselves. These are things that we don't know. Emotional sobriety really helps us learn how to have a healthy relationship, how to have union with the preservation of our integrity, how to cooperate with integrity. Most of us get lost in our relationships. Most of us do a lot of things we don't want to do. We don't really know how to show up in a good way. Emotional sobriety is about learning to have healthy relationships. Well, my dear friend and colleague Roger suggested that our next focus is to explore my most recent book, 12 Essential Insights for Emotional Sobriety, and I appreciate that suggestion a lot. And so what we're going to be doing is going through the 12 essential insights one at a time and discussing them. And I thought I'd kick it off the discussion today, and then in the weeks to follow, Herb will come in and Roger will come in, and then Tom, if he's able to join us again and share what stood out to them and what they wanted to elaborate on in that particular chapter. And in this chapter we're really looking at is called Waking Up from Our Sleepwalking. And I want to approach this in a couple of different ways, because I'm going to probably talk about this twice, because this is such an important, I think, foundation to developing a consciousness that supports emotional sobriety. This ability to wake up and to become aware of what we're doing and how we create our existence, how we create our problems, becomes such an important foundation, right, to all the work we need to do to establish and to integrate emotional sobriety into our life. And in the beginning of the chapter, I write about something, and Herb has given me permission to do this. This character Harold, I think when I describe him, maybe somebody, each and every one of you know if you've been coming to this Thursday night meeting. So I'm just going to read a couple pages of this, and then I want to talk about consciousness. So Harold entered my office wearing a standard issue business professional attire. He had a newly pressed and heavily starched white shirt, a J. Crew blue tie, a smartly matched sport jacket, gray wool trousers, and freshly shined Johnson & Murphy Oxford shoes. Every strand on his hair, every strand of hair on his head was in its proper place. Now, I don't recall if I have ever seen someone seated so stiffly on my couch before Harold sat on it. To say Harold was formal would be an understatement. His demeanor was as rigid as that heavily starched shirt that he wore. I wondered if there was a person inside this automation of a man. He started the session in a curious way. Dr. Berger, I'm not certain why I'm here. You see, I don't know what is wrong with me. He adjusted his tie and continued, on paper, I have everything I've ever wanted. I'm exceptionally successful in my career. I have a beautiful house overlooking the Pacific Ocean in Palos Verdes. I have a very loyal wife who has been sober for almost 5 years, and we've raised 3 great children. I have 4 years of sobriety, but something isn't right. I am unhappy and it baffles me. I just can't figure this out. I've worked the steps with my sponsor. I attend meetings on a regular basis. I start the day with reading from one day at a time, and I am still dissatisfied. Do you think I am asking for too much and that I should just be grateful for what I have? He queried. Oftentimes what is obvious to outsiders is not so obvious to us. This was the case with Harold. It was clear that he was lost inside the personality he had constructed. His personality was a kind of a prison rather than an expression of his true spirit, but he was blind to the cell he'd built. He was confined by his pervasive lack of self-awareness. His pervasive lack. I asked Harold to tell me what he was experiencing as he sat there in my office. He went on and talked about his personal philosophy of life and his accomplishments. He regurgitated the words he'd read in the big book, words we've all heard in the 12-step meetings, and various platitudes he picked up through his meditation books. But not once did he touch on what he was experiencing, what he was feeling as he sat with me. So I asked again, Harold, what are you experiencing right now? He looked at me as though I was speaking a foreign language. With all the sincerity available to him, he replied, "What do you mean, Dr. Berger? What do you mean?" Sometimes a person will avoid answering a question because it is too painful or too difficult to address. But this wasn't the case with Harold. No, he was dead serious. He had no idea what I was asking him to do. He could not describe his experience in my office, nor could he identify the feelings that arose within him. Harold was out of touch with himself. He lived his life from the shoulders up. He could go on and on about his thoughts and philosophize about recovery or even state of the economy if I asked him. But when it came to talking about himself in a more intimate and personal way, he fell mute. He was unaware of what he was feeling, of what was happening inside his body, of what it was like for him as he turned to me for help. He was unable to find the words that would describe his personal experience because he was desensitized to what he was feeling. He was desensitized to himself. One could almost say that I, a stranger, already knew more about Harold than Harold himself knew. We'll get into the question why later, but Harold was asleep, believing that he was awake. He was sleepwalking. Now, what we captured by just taking that snapshot of me interviewing and meeting Harold for the first time was a state of affairs that most people are in this life. We have been disconnected and desensitized from who we truly are. We are not aware of it. Now, what I want to show you is that I'm going to share with you some of the research that Piaget has done on the kind of consciousness that's created by a child's cognitive level of emotional development. And I'm sharing that with you because it's going to be an analog to what happens to our consciousness based on our emotional level of development. So let me share my screen with you. And we are going to look at Piaget's work on what he calls preoperational thinking.
Can you look at these two glasses? Do you think that they have the same amount of juice? You think they have the same? Okay. Now we're going to pour this juice into this glass. Now, do you think that this glass has more juice, this glass has more juice, or do you think that they have the same amount?
That one has more.
This one has more, and why do you think that this one has more?
Because it's taller.
Okay, so what we're learning from that experiment is that the child's cognitive development is such that it can only focus on one dimension of the phenomena that's occurring in front of the child. Now, in the beginning, The two glasses have the same amount of juice, right? They were level. The examiner asks her, are these the same or are they different? The child correctly says they're the same. Now, what she's paying attention to is the size of the glass, not the amount of juice in the glass. And how do we know that? Because when the examiner in front of her takes the glass that had the same amount of juice in it, that she just said was the same amount of juice, and pours it in a beaker that's taller than the other glass, what does the child say? That has more juice in it now, because the child is only attending to one dimension of the object in front of it. Now watch what happens in the next experiment.
Okay, you ready? Okay. Does this row have more quarters? Does this row have more quarters, or do they have the same?
1, 2, 3. Wait. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. They're both the same.
They're the same?
5, 5.
Okay, so now the child counts out the number of quarters in the rows. Now that would make you think that the child is focusing on the number of quarters, and that's why the child is saying that they're the same. But watch what happens. Now watch what the examiner does.
Okay. Okay. Does this row have more quarters? Does this row have more, or do they have the same?
This one has more.
That one has more quarters?
Yeah.
Why does this row have more quarters?
Because it's more far away.
It's more far away.
Yeah, it's more far away than that. Looks like bigger.
So once again, the child counted out 5 quarters. The child saw the examiner just spread the quarters out. But because the child is looking at the length of the line and comparing them, she says the top row has more quarters than the other row, even though the child had counted 5 quarters. So the child is not using the number of quarters. The child is focusing on only one dimension of what's happening in front of it and in front of her. Now watch what happens in the next experiment.
Bigger.
All right, we're going to play a game with the graham crackers, and we're going to share them between me and you, okay? Okay. Do you think that we shared those fairly?
No.
No, why not?
You share. You have those and I have this one.
Well, what if we try this? Okay, can I put this down right there?
Okay.
Now is it fair?
Yeah.
Yeah, why is it fair now?
Because we both have 2.
Can you tell me what you see?
So it's pretty amazing, isn't it? Now think about that. Now I want you to relate that to your emotional level of development. See, the more undifferentiated your consciousness is, the more you can only focus on one dimension in your reality. In many ways, when our differentiation is low, and I'll explain differentiation in a minute, or our emotional maturity is low, we're only able to see one dimension. And you know what dimension we see? That it's all about us. When we look at a situation, we are relating that situation to what it means about us. We're looking at that situation as what it reflects about us. You see, when our differentiation is low, our sense of personal importance is very high. And we think that everything is about us. So we end up taking everything personally. Now you see that if you're around a child, a young child, it's all about them. In developmental psychology, they talk about the egocentricity of the child. Well, Harry Tiebout, who befriended, Alcoholics Anonymous, said that in all the alcoholics he met, these infantile characteristics seem to persist into adulthood. But I don't think it's just us. I think it's part of this culture we live in that creates so much narcissism, unnatural narcissism. And so when we look at a situation and we react to the situation, we're looking at that situation by what it means about us. And when another person behaves a certain way, we're thinking that their behavior reflects their feelings towards us. Me, me, me. It's all about me. That consciousness we have is where all of our troubles exist in terms of developing any kind of a sense of emotional freedom or emotional sobriety. If emotional sobriety is defined as emotional autonomy, we cannot have any emotional autonomy if we take everything that's happening around us personally, as though it's a reflection of who we are, rather than just a reflection of the reality around us. You see, that becomes the big challenge here. And we have to somehow be able to start to see that this is what we're doing, to be able to now create another consciousness that can help us wake up and start to see a new possibility or another possibility. That child, and you'll hear Herb say over and over again, we don't know what we don't know. We can't see what we can't see. And that's so true. You see it with that child. The child just didn't know what it didn't know and couldn't see what it couldn't see because its level of cognitive development wouldn't allow it. That's the only reality that it had, and it was that child's reality. It's the same thing that's for us with our low differentiation. Low differentiation, just think of it as a low level of emotional maturity. But when we're undifferentiated, we fuse ourself and our feelings with everything around us. There's no differentiation. There's no boundaries between us and others. It all gets fused together. That becomes a serious, serious problem and an impediment to our growth. And to be able to learn how to better take care of ourselves. Because if we take everything personally, we end up being very reactive to situations. We end up being incredibly controlling because we want everything to go our way so that we feel okay. Now, I talked about, well, why was Harold so desensitized? Now, I'm not able to do that tonight because I just want to stop here and invite Roger and Herb in to kind of talk about consciousness and how they're thinking about this. But the next time I share, which won't be next time, I'll probably do it at the end of this chapter, I'll be talking about, the true self and false self and how we have to desensitize ourselves in order to pull off engineering and creating that false self. But that's for another day and time, and we'll leave this discussion where it stands today. Roger, good evening. Herb, good evening.
Hey, Al. Hey, Herb.
Hello, everybody.
I'll go ahead and jump in, Herb, if that's okay, unless you're burning to speak.
Always burn.
So, Alan, what the example you're talking about, because I can watch those Piaget experiments over and over and over. But I think the analogy that you're making is right on, is spot on. And as you say over and over, Herb, I cannot see how self-centered I am in my focus until I become less self-centered. I'm not able to see it. My awareness, my understanding is every bit as constrained as the level of cognitive development that we saw with those children was for them. And my obliviousness to how constrained my awareness is exactly the same as we saw with those kids. Al, what came to mind when you were speaking, because this is so hard experientially in our guts, in our hearts to get, this whole issue about taking things personally. What I love about you approaching it from both a cognitive and emotional perspective, Alan, is it really draws attention to, it's about our development, part of which is differentiation, right? And how differentiated we become, how much of a sense of separateness I have regarding myself and others, as well as connection. That's where it gets complex, right? That's where it gets very tricky, because neither one is the whole story. Neither the sense of boundaries or separation or the sense of connection. Both are needed for emotional maturation. So I love it because it helps me be less judgmental of myself and others in some ways. If I understand that these are developmental issues for us at a psychological level. They're not, I set out willfully, because I will do a lot of, bad things willfully as well. But
Yes.
fundamentally, this is about what's been missing in my development, not about what's wrong with me
Yes.
as a person. And I love, to me, this focus on Piaget and academic psychology in a way, but especially on cognitive development, and then tying it into emotional development is spot on. What it brought up for me, Al, is I remember you and I were working with a couple out in your office out here in Westlake Village when you were here. And this couple had a number of issues, but the central issue was the husband was not particularly communicative. And of course, his wife took this very personally. If you cared about me more, you would share more with me. If you cared about me more, when I asked you questions, you would talk with me like I talked with you. And she related almost all of the husband's behavior around her, as you were just saying, to his
Yep.
feelings
Remember that.
toward her and how he saw her,
Yep.
right? Then we went to her and him, and his perspective was that she's always what? She's always demanding of him, right? She's always pulling on him. And, he took that behavior very personally as being about him. So what you had them do, we separated them in two areas of the room, and we had him talk to his child self from his adult self perspective. And he just kind of asked the child questions. And we came in and asked the child self questions as well. And the child talked about how he was never taught how to talk about his feelings. He was never taught how to talk about himself. He was never taught the importance of disclosing what's going on for oneself with a partner. And at some point, she started to cry as she watched him do this process, because it had never occurred to her experientially in her heart and in her gut, or in a certain way, in cognitively as well, that his behavior had next to nothing to do with her. That his behavior was a deeply ingrained pattern from his earliest years, and that it was very anxiety provoking for him to start to talk about himself, because that was never welcomed, which means he was not welcomed. So then, and people listening can guess where we went next. We did the same thing with her, and she started talking about how she got a lot of encouragement for, connecting and verbalizing and expressing herself, even to the point of in her family, people made a lot of demands on each other and had a lot of expectations of each other. Same thing, only this time they both started crying, if I remember right. He really started to see, for the first time, to actually experience and feel, oh my God, all that pestering of me she does, all that demanding of me she does, it's not about me. And it was the most vivid example I ever recall of two people in a relationship beginning, and even then it's just a beginning, believe me, because the old patterns are very likely to reassert themselves quite quickly, just out of conditioning, right? Just out of habit, as well as ways they might be protective of us. But I just wanted to, allude to that example, because to me it's a great one about something we all do. And here's another little more subtle aspect of this. You talked about, us perceiving that the other person's behavior has to do with us and how our partner or friend or mate or whoever it is sees us, and how we take that personally, that their behavior is about us. But I wanted to add this additional piece. Even when the other person thinks their behavior is about us too, right? And they're sure of it, because
Right.
I've triggered them in a certain way or activated their history and their feelings in a certain way, where it's very clear to them, that I'm making them feel this way. Or another day it would be, I'm sure that they're making me feel all these ways, right? Because that's how it comes to us. That's certainly how children experience relationships. Is if Tammy or Jimmy does something hurtful to me, you made me sad, or you made me mad. But here's the thing, even if in the other person's mind and in mine, I'm 100% convinced that their behavior is about me, there's a very good chance it's not. There's a great chance that her behavior or his behavior, my partner or friend's behavior, is still largely about their history and their way of perceiving things. So I wanted to add that even if both people think that one or the other is the cause or is the one eliciting the behavior, it's not necessarily so. Now, again, from my self-acceptance orientation, I'll spend years, which I did, and decades, beating up on myself or others, especially myself, for this failing or this limitation or that limitation. But to me, the idea now is like just to try to understand these patterns and have some forgiveness and insight into where I come from with this stuff. And then both cognitively and behaviorally, in small steps, set about starting to change it. Oh, there I go again, taking her behavior personally. Oh, there I go again, inflicting my mind reading on this person, or my blamefulness on the. That's where it usually begins, just to start to become aware of what we haven't been aware of before. So thank you, Al. That was really, really good.
You're welcome, Raj. And I just want to emphasize one thing, especially that you said, and you really picked it up well. See, by emphasizing the developmental aspect of this, we take the shame out of it.
Yeah.
Right. And we've been trying to do that. Herb, we talked about this, about how can we start to look at these things in a way that doesn't create shame in a bad feeling in ourselves about what we're looking at when we talk about character defaults instead of character defects, right? I mean, it's those kinds of changing our language to be less adversarial with ourselves. See, this ties back into this whole discussion we had about self-esteem, is can we develop a language that supports our development and our growth? And that's what we're really trying to do. So picking that up is really important, Raj. It's another interesting thing, and it just hit me. We talk about, and Bill talked about this a lot in step 6, when he was talking about getting ready to have these character defects removed, about how these character defects seem to give something to us. Well, what do we get out of taking things personally? Well, we think then, therefore, we can control situations. If it's all about me, then obviously I could do something to change it, right? See, it's also that illusion or fantasy we have that gets supported by this. But that's for another time and place. Let me turn it over to Herb real quick.
As usual, so much opening to so many conversations, both knowledge and experience. And I went all the way back to my very first experience of waking up as I see it today anyway. And that was when I went to support Mary's recovery in the hospital, they asked me a question. Now I'm suffering because she's in the hospital. We have a lot of inconvenience, and I wasn't suffering because of me. I was suffering because of my inconvenience, quite frankly.
Yes. I remember that. I do remember that.
You were there 40 years ago, good Lord. But anyway, they asked me this question: what is your history with alcohol? Not a general biography, a focused autobiography on my problem, excuse me, not problem, I didn't say that, my history with alcohol. And for whatever reason, I was willing to look at that. I was in the game. And that's another piece of it, is the willingness to be in the game and kind of open, really seriously. I was just like there, and I wanted to help. And they asked me that question and I answered it. And I began to suspect a pattern, and then they had me read it out loud. There's two elements here. They asked me a question, I was willing to write it out, then I was willing to read it out. And it was that whole combination that was startling to me. Not that I had a drinking problem, that was pretty evident from the writing and the talking, but that I had never seen it. I'm 43 years old. I have a history of lots of education, academic, reflective, philosophical, psychological, theological, all this kind of background, reflective. And I had never connected the dots. Well, it opened me up with some sense of shock. All right. But then nothing else really happened until 4 years later. I'm talking to this man because he's saying some stuff about his life, and I knew it was true and it wasn't for me. And I related to him my history, and he goes, Herb, you have a lot of information, but you have no transformation. And again, he took me through a process where I was able to have an experience of seeing something that was so obvious, but I had no clue at 48 years old, 4 years sober, about this. I'm responsible. For the very first time, I'm not a victim. And so I had this, and it continued for a while, to the point where in 1994, I'm 10 years sober, 54 years old, and this man shared with me about Einstein. The consciousness that created the problem cannot be the consciousness that solves a problem. And he said, would you be willing to pray a prayer to set aside all of your prior knowledge, all of your prior experience, and go into some questions, writing out the answer and having dialogue about them? The pattern was absolutely the same with the questions and my writing it out, and then my saying it out in the context of a witness. And I saw at age 55, 10 years sober, that my whole concept of spirituality and religion was the very thing that was blocking me from any type of authentic relationship and experience. Then Alan steps officially into my life as we're colleagues, and we're talking about emotional sobriety. And I've been waking up over the last 20 years to so many other things, like reality is what it is, and it's not personal. I mean, it's kind of like, oh my God, how come I'm 83 years old and I can't get it sooner than this? Come on. So we don't know that we don't know until we know that we don't know. And if we're willing to then continue to be humble enough, to be open enough to the questions and to take the actions and to get some feedback, whew, as you said, Alan, be curious and be willing to be surprised.
That's right. And who was Harold, by the way? That's you. That's right. That was you when I'll never forget it. I still see that shirt you had on, and I mean, your hair was, I mean, it's like you had somebody come in and do it before you left the house in the morning.
Well, yeah, that's when they had spray cans, right? And I had hair.
You did have hair. You did have hair. I don't think I had any, but you had some at that point. Okay, gentlemen. Well, good. We're off to a great start. And Roger, I really do appreciate you suggesting that we use this as the format going forward.
Does someone need to believe in God to successfully overcome addiction? Well, the way I like to think about what the program does, it connects us to who we really are. And what does that mean? Well, there's this incredible force in you and I, this growth force. It's the force that moved us from crawling to walking. You wanted to take those first steps. And when you fell, and you fell a lot of times, you didn't let your failures stop you. You picked yourself up, you learned from it. And how many times did you fail before you walked? You failed as many times as you needed to. You see that force, I call it a biological imperative, a psychological imperative, a spiritual imperative. It's moving you towards wholeness. It's moving you to be what you can be. Just like in the acorn is all the information it needs to become an oak tree. In you is all the information you need to become you. Become a you that can cope with life and to deal with whatever you need to deal with to be okay. And that's what I'll talk about in my new book, The 12 Essential Insights for Emotional Sobriety.